Oh, there we go. So before we kind of dive into material here today, not a whole lot to kind of mention off the top. Just a reminder that Canvas discussion is due at the end of the week. I'll try to revisit it again Thursday if we have time at the end of class. Maybe I'll revisit today. But your initial post, kind of using that data source, needs to have some table mentioned and the statistics from it to support your initial post. Kind of whatever questions you decide to answer from that initial prompt. Once you post that, you will then be able to respond to other students. So the quicker you guys get on and start working on this, the easier it is for all of you to start replying to each other's posts. Okay, so that's due at the end of the week on Friday at the end of the day. I know it's technically fall break on Friday, but if you want to do it earlier than that, you can. If not, if you want me to just make the due date a day earlier, I can. But I figure having it open till the end of the day Friday gives you a little flexibility. I also there should be an announcement kind of posting after class. I will only have virtual office hours on Wednesday. So if you want to meet, I'll have that virtual link open, keeping an eye on it. I won't be able to physically be in my office. However, if you do want to meet in person, once again, I know it's fall break, but I will be around on Friday working. So I think I put up an announcement 9 to noon. If you want to stop by in person Friday, I'll be in my office then. So even more office hours than usual. It's just that Wednesdays are going to be virtual this week. Okay. Also, there's a CL cancellation for Thursday night. I put up what locations it's going to be in the announcement that will pop up on Canvas. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's one of the ones that's in Ballantine. So it will be the 5:20 session in biology and the 6:30 and 7:40 in Ballantine. So there will still be 2 locations at every single time slot available. So there's, if you still wanted to go at that specific day and time, you can. They'll be available. But there will still be CL sessions this Thursday and then next Monday covering Module 7, which after we go through subsidies at the beginning of class, we'll jump right into Module 7 material today. We're kind of back to old hat after Thursdays. Last night, Module 5 and 6 quiz was due. Module 7 reading was due. After class Thursday, you'll see Module 8's reading and kind of that next Module 7 quiz pop up, due at the end of the day next Monday. Okay? Any other questions for me before we dive in to Module 7 material here today? Okay? And what I just said about office hours in that CL session, like I said, announcement will pop up after class. I just didn't want to have it before class and get questions before I could kind of talk about it here. Okay? So I've got up the slides here, but I'm going to start out kind of drawing out for us subsidies. Okay? So we left off, one of the freebie questions in the last quiz was related to subsidies. It's going to be similar to taxes, but everything kind of works a little bit the opposite, right? So if I think about a market, and I've got my supply curve, I've got my demand curve. Demand reflects marginal benefits. Supply reflects marginal costs. I'm going to have that equilibrium quantity and price. So one thing I'll start doing today, once we start talking about externalities, but it kind of also can work if it helps when we're thinking about taxes, subsidies, government intervention. Sometimes I'll reference this quantity, this equilibrium quantity, would be like the quantity that the market would choose without any government intervention. Right? So kind of 2 different ways of referencing that equilibrium quantity. This will make a little bit more sense once we start talking about externalities. Why it might be helpful to mention it is not the equilibrium quantity, but the quantity that the market will arrive at, which is essentially the equilibrium quantity. So when we had taxes, right, I said I was kind of imposing an additional cost on either the producers or consumers. So for the sake of subsidies, I'll always give you the depiction as though we're taxing producers. I'm going to make it a little bit easier, and I did taxes, it could be on either producers or consumers. With subsidies, I'll only kind of use models where I show you a subsidy to producers, okay? So if I give people money for doing something, what am I doing to a company's costs? Their costs will be whatever they were before, but now if I'm giving them money to do it, their costs are going to go down. So at every single point, if I give producers money for making something or I give them a subsidy, at every quantity, what have I done? I've lowered their marginal cost essentially. Because their marginal cost will be whatever it was before minus, right, whatever amount of money that they're getting from the government. So I can think about subsidies. This is supposed to be parallel. I'm doing my best to draw it here. I can kind of think about my supply curve plus the subsidy will actually be lower. Or intuitively, if I give producers money for doing something, are they going to want to supply more or less? So my supply curve should increase or shift to the right, right? So subsidies will increase our supply curve, okay? So after that subsidy, what's the new price that we see in the market? Well, where's that new supply curve where the subsidy hit demand? After the subsidy, we're actually going to be at a quantity that is higher than it was before, right? So here with a subsidy, the market is going to be doing what relative to the equilibrium? Over or under producing? They're producing more. They are overproducing relative to that equilibrium point. Okay. Now, the new price that we see after the subsidy, right? So this is kind of like the price after the subsidy. What this ends up becoming is the new price that consumers will pay. So we said with taxes, we started to have a difference between the price consumers pay and the price sellers keep. With taxes, the price the consumer pays was always what? Higher or lower than before the tax. So if I tax something, that's generally going to raise the price consumers pay, but sellers only got to keep the amount the consumer handed over, and then they had to pay the tax. So the price the consumer paid went up, the price the seller or producer got to keep went down. Was that a good or a bad thing for producers and consumers? Bad for both. If consumers are paying a higher price, sellers are keeping less than before, both of them were worse off. We saw a decrease in producer and consumer surplus. If I instead have a subsidy, when I hand over $100, if there's a $50 subsidy given to the producers, they get my $100 plus $50 from the government. So the price that the seller keeps will be whatever the consumer pays, plus what's the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with the subsidy? The difference is just the value of the subsidy. So the price the consumer pays plus the value of the subsidy, or where we'd be at on that supply curve, that's now going to represent the price the seller gets to keep. Or if we want to write it out, right, the price the seller gets to keep will be the price the consumer pays plus that value of the subsidy. So what has happened to the price that consumers pay? Relative to the equilibrium, it has went down. What's happened to the price the sellers keep relative to the equilibrium? So is this going to be a good or a bad thing for producers and consumers? Consumers are paying less. Consumer surplus, you can likely guess, is going to go up. Sellers are keeping more, so producer surplus should go up as well. So it's a little bit harder to think about where is the deadweight loss from this market going to come. So I'm going to use this. I've got a different depiction in the slides, and then I might kind of have some other way of showing you this. Okay. So what would consumer surplus be? Anytime we're talking about anyone's surplus, it's the difference between the marginal benefits and their marginal costs. For the consumer, what's representing their marginal benefits? The demand curve. What represents their marginal cost? When you buy something, the marginal cost to you is the price. So the new price consumers pay, that will be their new price. The old demand curve represents their marginal, that's the old, but it's still the same demand curve. So consumer surplus would be that area above the new price they pay, but below the demand curve. Now, what is producer surplus going to be? Well, producer surplus is going to be the area below their marginal benefit. When I sell something, what's the marginal benefit? The price I charge. What are my marginal costs? Those are represented by my supply curve. So producer surplus would be kind of this entire area, okay? So if I didn't have a subsidy, what would total surplus in the market be? Simply the difference between what? So I don't care if it's producers or consumers. I just want to look at total surplus. It's the area in between what two curves? What represents marginal benefits in the market? Demand. What represents marginal costs? So for total surplus, if we were just looking without a subsidy, here is total surplus, just the area in between supply and demand. After the subsidy, notice producer surplus gained this area, consumer surplus gained some area as well. This area in the middle where I have both colors, it's surplus that's kind of getting double counted, right? It's both producer and consumer surplus. These little triangles represent new consumer producer surplus that didn't exist before. So if producer and consumer surplus went up, are subsidies a bad thing? Seems like they're going to be good, right? Hold on. When we have a government action, whose surplus do we now need to factor in? The government's. With taxes, that was a positive amount of surplus because they were generating tax revenue. If the government is giving a subsidy, they're generating government expenditures, right? Or it's an additional cost, right? Someone has to pay the subsidy, it's going to be the government. So if I think about this, what would the total cost to the government be, right? So if I'm thinking about kind of the cost to the government of this subsidy, it's going to be what? The value of the subsidy on every unit multiplied by the quantity I see sold after I give this subsidy, right? If I got the number, the amount of money I have to pay per unit for the subsidy times the number of units, that tells me the total amount of money the government's going to have to spend. So what would that be represented by in this graph? Well, what's the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with the subsidy? That's just the value of the subsidy. What would the base of this rectangle always be? The quantity after the subsidy. So this rectangle would represent my government expenditure, right? So you'll notice that area that was double counted, I now would subtract out the government expenditure, so it only gets counted once, just like before the subsidy. Those new triangles were canceled out by an additional government expenditure. And then what we're left with is this little triangle here, which is new negative surplus, right? It's a government expenditure that isn't canceled out by any gain to producers and consumers. So this is going to represent our what? Deadweight loss, okay? So with all these colors, there's a lot going on, and I'll kind of show it to you in the slides, a different way of looking at it, but it gets kind of tricky. An easier way to think about why deadweight loss is what it is let's just think about, let's take some of this away, and I'll focus about thinking about it in a different way, and I think it'll help. And if I'm wrong, you can let me know, right? So if I've got a market, and here's kind of that current equilibrium or the quantity that the market was choosing, okay? If I have a subsidy, we said my supply curve plus the subsidy represents that the producer's costs are now lower than they were before. So the new quantity after the subsidy will be out here, okay? So we said relative to where the market chose, after the subsidy, the market is going to do what? It's going to overproduce. So we said with taxes, it always pushed the quantity to be lower. So the market would then underproduce with a tax. So we were going to be missing out on some surplus that would have existed without the tax. With a subsidy, the deadweight loss comes from the exact opposite kind of angle, right, or direction. We're now overproducing. So what is going to be the total surplus in the market? If I'm thinking about, I'm jumping the gun. Total surplus is simply going to be my marginal benefits minus my marginal cost, which are represented by my supply and demand curve. So every single unit that's produced past that allocated efficient point that the market was at after the government uses a subsidy, notice for every single one of these units, what's true about the marginal costs relative to the marginal benefits? The marginal costs are, so what's going to be true about the total surplus from every one of these units? It would be negative. So when the market chooses this higher quantity, every unit here is generating negative surplus. So we're just decreasing total surplus, or we're creating deadweight loss, right? So I think this is an easier way to think about deadweight loss. You know, technically, you could calculate producer surplus, calculate consumer surplus, add those together, and then subtract out the government expenditure. That would give you deadweight loss. All right, that was kind of like with all the shading going on. Or you can just remember the deadweight loss comes from the fact that we're overproducing now with a subsidy. And for every single unit, what's the value of surplus lost? The difference between my supply and demand curves. And if my supply curve is higher, that difference would represent a negative surplus value that's being added to this market. Okay? Now, you'll also notice what will this triangle always be? So the height would always be what? What's the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with the subsidy? So value, so my deadweight loss will always be the value of the subsidy. What's the base always going to be? Yeah, the difference between the quantity after the subsidy and the quantity the market was choosing. This would kind of be my number of units I'm overproducing by, right? So whatever that difference is. And then we have linear supply and demand curves. So we have to then multiply by half because we'll have that triangle there, okay? So I would think finding it this way is easier. But if you wanted to calculate producer consumer surplus where there's overlap and then there's overlap with government expenditure, you'll subtract that out. You should get the exact same value, okay? But I would argue that this is probably quite a bit easier to think about, okay? Now, if you compare this to taxes, the deadweight loss triangle, it's still a triangle, but it's like pointing in the opposite direction, right? One way I've heard people talk about this, it helps you remember. If it doesn't, by all means, scrap it. But this triangle is pointing to the left with a subsidy, which means that we actually want the quantity to be lower, right? The subsidy was overproducing, right? With a tax, that deadweight loss triangle is pointing to the right, which meant we want more of something. It meant the market with the tax was actually underproducing. That helps. Hold on to it. If it doesn't, that's okay, right? I don't know. That always kind of doesn't line up with my way of thinking, but I know not everyone thinks the same way I do, right? It's probably a good thing. Okay. All right. Any questions kind of over our subsidies before we jump to the slides here real quick on them? Okay. So, yeah. Yep. So what would the new price be after this subsidy? So where is the new supply curve with the subsidy? Right here. So where would it hit the demand curve? That's going to be the price the consumer pays. So when we have taxes and subsidies, there's a difference. There's not one single price. There's the price the consumer pays. What does the seller get to keep? Whatever the price the consumer pays plus the value of the subsidy. Well, if I take the price the consumer pays plus that value of the subsidy, that's just the difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with the subsidy. So this would be the price the seller now gets to keep. Yep. Okay. So if I can get this out of the way here. So just a different way of looking at this, and it's really kind of a lot of what I've already worked through. We said that if I had a market that was in equilibrium, and I just chose some numbers here, when I impose a subsidy and I give a subsidy to producers, that'll increase that supply curve. Right? So the new price that the market will arrive at will be the price the consumer pays. Okay. Now, when the price the consumer pays is lower, we said, is that going to be a good thing for consumers? Yes. So we saw consumer surplus go up, but this is not the new price that sellers keep, right? The price that the sellers get to keep, would be whatever the price the money the consumer hands over plus the amount of money they get from the government. So what would the value of my subsidy be in this model? What's the difference between the price the consumer pays and the price the seller keeps? The value of the subsidy. So what's the value of my subsidy here? What's the difference between the price the consumer pays and the seller keeps? 200, right? How many units is this market overproducing by? Well, the market where supply is equal to demand would be 15, after the subsidy 25, so we're overproducing by 10 units. And then if I wanted to calculate deadweight loss, we said I would just take those number of units I'm overproducing by times that difference between my supply curve and my supply curve with the subsidy, the value of the subsidy, and then we have linear supply and demand, so we then multiply it by a half. So for every unit that we're overproducing here, the loss of surplus is the area in between that supply and demand curve, right? Now, because supply is representing marginal costs, our costs are greater than our benefits. this is all negative surplus that we're getting when we use subsidies. Okay. So another way of thinking about why that deadweight loss is what it is. So here's a market in equilibrium. The blue triangle represents what? What's always on top? Consumer surplus. It's the area below the demand curve. That's their marginal benefits. Now remember, every surplus is the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs. So why is it the area below the demand curve but above price? Price to the consumer is their cost, right? Their marginal cost. So the area above price but below demand, that would be our consumer surplus. The red area above supply but below the price. Well, if we're using the supply curve, this should represent producer surplus. The price for producers is their marginal. When you sell something, the price is your marginal benefit, right? So that's why that was our producer surplus. So total surplus before the subsidy is here. After this subsidy, we get the overproduction, right? Oh, and I'm gonna, hold on. There we go. So that won't happen again, okay? So after the subsidy, we said, where would consumer surplus be? The area below demand, but above the price consumers pay, right? We're calculating consumer surplus. So notice that blue triangle got quite a bit larger, right? Now, what about producer surplus? Area above the supply curve, but below the new price they receive. The red triangle also got quite a bit bigger. So it looks like, oh, great, subsidy increased total surplus. What have I not factored in yet? No, I don't add in deadweight loss to figure out what deadweight loss is. Who is now involved in the market? The government, right? They gave the subsidy. So I need to factor in government expenditure. What is the height of this rectangle? The value of the subsidy. What's the base? The quantity after the subsidy. If I take the amount of money given per unit, the subsidy, times how many units are being produced and consumed in the market, that's just the total government expenditure. So that entire rectangle would represent the government expenditure here. So notice here, all of that kind of gain to consumer and producer surplus and the area that was double counted. Well, the area that was double counted is now only going to be counted once. The gains to producer and consumer surplus will be canceled out by this additional expenditure. And then this area here is going to be where there was no gains to surplus, but there was an additional expenditure. So the change will just be whatever that triangle is. So that's why my deadweight loss becomes that triangle that's in between the quantity of the market before, quantity of the market after the subsidy, and then that height of that triangle was always going to be the value of the subsidy. Okay. So once again, if you want, calculate the red, the blue triangle, the yellow government expenditure, add the surpluses, subtract the government expenditure, should always give you the same thing as if you just calculate the area of this triangle on the right here, representing here's the loss of surplus from every additional unit that was overproduced, okay, relative to before the subsidy was given. Okay. So just a different way of kind of visualizing this. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. So that's subsidies, right? The next thing that we're going to start diving into is this idea of externalities. So externalities, right? We have two different types and they can come from two different sources. We're going to focus a lot more on the types as opposed to the sources because the sources don't ultimately end up mattering a lot, okay? So I can have a market that's existing, and if there's a person who is not a producer or a consumer of that good, but they incur an additional cost or benefit because it exists, those are what we're going to call externalities. If they incur an additional cost, that's a negative externality. If they incur an additional benefit, that's a positive externality. So examples of this would be like, if I have positive production externalities, when something is produced, it provides benefits to people that aren't involved in the market. So I always think about like, I don't generally try to eat baked goods, right? So I'm not really a producer or a consumer, but when I'm like down the square and I walk by, I don't know, Square Donuts or somewhere like that where it's cooking, I love that smell of baked goods. I'm not a producer or consumer, But the fact that that is being produced, the fact that they're making donuts in the morning, I get an additional benefit by simply existing. I'm not involved in the market, but I get an additional benefit to it existing, right? So that would be the idea of a positive kind of production externality. Negative production externalities are an easy one. The easiest example is to think about, let's say, I don't drive. Let's say I don't drive, right? I don't buy or produce cars, but the fact that cars are produced and consumed in the market creates what? Pollution, which causes a cost to me if I'm walking around in smog, right? So the production can also create of a good additional cost to people, even if they're not involved in that market, right? Other people in society. Positive consumption externalities, all of you are a good example of that. When you get your college degree, even people who don't have a college degree, they're not a producer, they're not a college, or they're not a consumer, they haven't gotten a college degree. Why might they have a positive externality? Hopefully all of you are going to be more productive members of society, find ways for companies to cut costs, which will lower prices, come up with new inventions, et cetera, right? So that would be an example of the fact that you're consuming education. There's positive externalities or additional benefits to people who aren't even involved in the market for education. And then negative consumption externalities, I always think about this, like if I'm down at upstairs pub, right, and I don't enjoy the smell of smoke, I'm not a consumer or a producer of cigarettes, and I walk out the door and there's someone chain smoking in front of it, that's a huge negative externality to me, right? Because I've got to walk through this smoke now. I'm not involved in that market, but it's created a negative externality to me, okay? So we've got positive, negative externalities, positive additional benefits, negative additional costs, and they can either come from the production or consumption of a good, okay? Now, ultimately, what we're going to want to focus on is just whether it's a negative externality or whether it's a positive externality. We won't really focus a lot on where it comes from, okay? Because I'm going to try to simplify this module and the exam for you and show you one way to model both negative externalities and one way to model positive externalities. There are technically two ways to model each, but if I give you four instead of two, do you think that's going to be easier or harder to keep everything straight? Probably harder, right? So I'm just only going to focus on one way of modeling it and only expect you to know one way to model positive and negative externalities, okay? So if I've got kind of my original market, we're going to start to make a distinction. I said demand is marginal benefits, but more specific now, when we are thinking about society, demand represents the marginal benefits only to the consumers in that market, or what we'll start calling the private marginal benefits, okay? And I'll kind of show this to you off the slides here in a second, a different way that I'll sometimes write this just to kind of help clarify. The supply curve represented marginal cost, but it was only to the producers in that market. So we'll think about these as our private marginal costs, right? So private means just the people that are involved in this market. Now, if I have this market equilibrium in price, right? But if a negative externality exists, at every single quantity, there's going to be additional what? Negative externality means other people in society are going to incur an additional cost, right? So what way do you think makes the most sense? If I'm going to model additional costs, should I model that through the supply or demand curve? What represents costs? So it probably makes more sense to model it through the supply curve. I can model it through the demand curve, but I think it's a little more confusing, so I'm trying to choose the one that's easier. Okay? So if I think about my supply curve, right, representing the cost of the producers, if I wanted to model what we'll call society's supply curve, or the marginal social cost, not the private marginal cost, that's going to be the marginal cost to the producers plus the cost to everybody else in society that isn't involved in that market. So if I have additional cost, my society's supply curve is always going to be what relative to the original supply curve. If it's higher cost, it should be higher, right? Or what does this look like? A increase or decrease in supply. If it's to the left, it looks like a, if we can't do this, the second exam is not going to go any better, right? A leftward shift in supply would be a decrease, right? Now, it's not technically decreasing supply, right? Because our old supply curve still is what it is. It's just that the supply curve for society will factor in these additional costs that the producers weren't. The producers don't care if they cause pollution. It's not causing them any money. right? It's causing other people in society this additional cost, right? So we now kind of have this difference, and I'll usually write this as like MSC, for here's our private marginal cost, or the supply curve, and here's our marginal social costs, okay? So if I now have society's cost being a little bit higher, do you think society is going to want more or less of this good? Less. Well, we can kind of think about why. If I have my supply and demand curve, where will the market choose the quantity to be? Simply where supply is equal to demand. So that's going to be here at a quantity of, whoops, 25, right? Here, I'll get rid of this here. Supply is equal to demand at 25. Where would society want this quantity to be? Well, they're going to choose where their marginal benefit is equal to their marginal cost. But society's marginal benefit is still the demand curve, but their costs are now higher. So where does society's marginal cost hit that marginal benefit? At a quantity of 20, right? Now notice for any quantity below that, what's true about society's costs relative to the benefits? Society's costs are lower. So society's economic surplus for this 10th unit would be positive or negative. Well, if the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal cost of society, that 10th unit would have a positive economic surplus for society, right? In fact, every unit below 20, the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal cost to society. Now, the problem is past that 20th unit, up to the 25th, for the market, what's true about the marginal costs, the private marginal costs and private marginal benefits? The marginal benefits are still greater than the private marginal cost. So the market will choose to produce all these units from 20 to 25. But for society, what is total economic surplus for every unit from 20 to 25? Well, society's marginal costs for every unit here are greater than the marginal benefits. So the surplus from these units for society would actually be, costs are greater than the benefits. This economic surplus would be negative, which means every unit we're overproducing by, past that efficient point for society of 20, what are we creating? Negative surplus would be dead weight loss, right? So with negative externalities, the market doesn't factor in these additional external costs. So the market is going to do what here? Over or underproduce? Well, if they're ignoring some costs to society, they're going to overproduce this good. The fact that they're overproducing, for every unit they overproduced, they were creating dead weight loss for society, or they were costing society some economic surplus. Okay. So let's think about this in a slightly different way, right? So this is, if I was drawing this out for you, I would think about it this way, right? So I'll kind of start to use some slightly different notation even than I had in the slides on this, just to kind of help clarify some of these things, right? So when I write that supply is the marginal costs and demand represents the marginal benefits, technically I can kind of think about this as it's the private marginal costs and private marginal benefits. I usually won't write the P in there, right? I might sometimes say it, right? But when we're thinking about the supply and demand curve, they only represent the marginal benefits and marginal costs to the people in this market, or the kind of private marginal costs and benefits that exist in this market. Okay? So the market is always going to choose this equilibrium quantity if no one gets involved, right? If they're making the decision, they're going to be right here. Okay? Now we said with negative externalities, right, at every point, whatever the external cost is, or whatever the value, the per unit value of that negative externality is, the cost to society will be whatever the producer's costs were, plus that value of the negative externality, or the external cost. Okay? So at every point, society's costs are going to be higher, so our marginal social cost curve will always be higher, right? Now, another way you might see this written, right? So I can think about what are my marginal social costs. It's that old supply curve plus the value of that external cost, right? Or my private marginal costs plus the value of that external cost, okay? Now, the book used some notation about like calling this like S2 and then referencing it. I think that gets a little confusing. I'm not ever going to do that. So the kind of graphical depictions in the books, I think, are a little bit more complicated than they, or I shouldn't say complicated. I don't like the notation. It doesn't make it as clear. What's another way I could think about my marginal social costs? And if this doesn't help, you don't have to, but you can kind of think about it as it represents society's supply curve. All right? So here's society's supply curve. If I don't have any positive externalities, we haven't talked about those yet, the marginal benefits that exist in the market, if there's no additional benefits, what are the benefits to society? The exact same thing, right? So we're only going to look at one at a time, negative or positive externalities. Right now, we're just looking at negative externalities. So the marginal benefits to the consumers in the market, that's the only benefits that exist. We're going to assume that for right now. So where would society's marginal cost be equal to society's marginal benefit? Right here, right? Marginal social cost equal to the marginal social benefit. They're actually going to choose a quantity, or the quantity that would be allocatively efficient for society is actually going to be at a quantity that is lower than what the market chooses. Okay, so writing this as QE or QM, I'm really saying the same thing. I just think sometimes thinking about it as the quantity the market chooses is sometimes more helpful in these externality examples than thinking about it as the equilibrium quantity, right? Because technically, this is like the equilibrium quantity for society, and this is like the equilibrium quantity for the market, right? We have a difference now, okay? So I'll draw this out, and I've got a depiction in the slides. Once again, kind of like with subsidies, it'll become complicated before I simplify it, right? So what would producer surplus in this market be? Well, it's going to be whatever price the market chooses. Where would producer surplus be? The area below price, but above what? The supply curve, right? We've got to get this down because we're just going to keep complicating. So here would be kind of my producer surplus. Where is consumer surplus going to be? The area below our demand curve, but above, excuse me, the price, right? So here's total surplus if I don't factor in this negative externality, okay? However, if I think about what is total surplus for society, well, what is total surplus for society? It would simply be the difference between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal costs. So what's the difference between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal cost? Society's surplus is just right here, okay? So if we're not at that allocated efficient point for society, that market is going to create some deadweight loss. Well, initially, it's kind of hard to see because it's like, okay, well, I've got that area, but I've got even more, right? Producer and consumer surplus is even larger than society's surplus. But what haven't we factored in? When this market exists, for every unit, there is a what? External cost. So if we want to think about what is the total value or what is the total cost of that negative externality, what would it be equal to? Whatever the per unit external cost is times the number of units the market decides to produce and consume, or kind of that market equilibrium. So visually on this graph, it's hard to think about what would represent that. But what's the difference between my marginal social cost and my supply curve? We said that difference is always the value of the negative externality, or the per unit value. So my external cost. Okay, that's one of the things I needed. What is the second thing I need? I need the quantity the market would choose. So if I think about this parallelogram here, what would its base be? The quantity the market chooses. What would the height of that parallelogram be? The external cost. So that parallelogram would represent the total cost to society. So notice, if I've got producer and consumer surplus, But for every unit, there's this negative externality. All of that producer and consumer surplus here is like washed out by a loss to society. And then in addition to that, what do we have here? We have a loss to society that isn't canceled out by any producer or consumer surplus. So going past that efficient point for society, what did we say this would represent? This is my deadweight loss, right? Once again, kind of similar to subsidies. This is probably a more complicated way of thinking about it. We got a lot of overlapping surpluses. But if I just think about, here's my supply curve, here's my demand curve, here's the quantity that the market would choose, right? If I look at my marginal social cost, right, and I said we don't have any positive externalities, so the benefits that exist to the private consumers here is the same as to society. There's no additional benefits. The society would want the quantity to be down here. So I'm drawing the same graph, but I'm just taking away everything I shaded in. Well, for every unit that the market overproduces relative to the efficient point for society, what would the loss of total surplus to society be? We said total surplus in society is the difference between marginal social benefits and marginal social costs. So for every unit in this range, what's true about the marginal social costs relative to the marginal social benefits? So every unit here that the market is overproducing would have what type of economic surplus to society? Negative. So this would be a loss of surplus. So kind of similar to subsidies, what will our deadweight loss with negative externalities be? What's the height of this triangle always going to be? What's the difference between society's costs and the private marginal costs? This is just the per unit value of the negative externality of the external cost. What is the base? So we've got the external cost. What is the base of that triangle always going to be? The difference between the quantity the market chooses and society's efficient point, or how many units, so number of units that we're overproducing by. That'll always be the height and the base of that triangle. And then we have linear supply and demand curves. So we said calculating deadweight loss, we would then always have to multiply by 1/2. So this looks very similar to subsidies, right? In terms of how we're calculating deadweight loss. In fact, if you want to write it down, I mean, when we have subsidies or we have negative externalities, this is where it gets to be kind of counterintuitive. Both of them create deadweight loss because of the overproduction of a good, right? When we look at taxes, what do you think it's going to look similar to? If subsidies look like negative externalities, taxes probably look like positive externalities. So like I said, kind of counterintuitive, but taxes and positive externalities, that deadweight loss is going to be created by the underproduction of a good, okay? So what's the height of the triangle? The external cost. So what's the base? What will this always be? The difference between the quantity the market chooses and what the efficient point for society would be. So that base will always be essentially the number of units the market is overproducing relative to that efficient point for society. Yep. Yeah. We'll say it again. This? I mean, not really anything. I guess if you want to think about it, it would be the gains to the market from overproducing. So here's I don't want to, this is a good question. I wouldn't probably extend it to this far, but since you asked it, what would this parallelogram represent? It was the external cost times the number. So this would actually be like the total additional cost to society from the overproduction. What would this triangle represent? It's the gains from the overproduction, but only to who? Well, if it's the difference between supply and demand, it's going to be the gains to only the people in the market. So here's from the overproduction of this good, the market is going to gain, but society is going to lose. So what's the total loss to society? Well, there was a gain to the people in the market that was kind of canceled out by a loss to society. So that's a wash, right? Or that's, no, it's no change. But what was the additional cost to society that wasn't balanced out or compensated for by gains to the market? That would be our deadweight loss. So that triangle would kind of represent the additional cost to society that was compensated for by gains in the market. But I wouldn't necessarily ask you what that represents. But that's, if you want to think about it that way. Yep. This. Yeah. I mean, once again, I'm not going to ask you about, I mean, it has some relevance to us, but you would think about this. I mean, this is even less interpretable, but it would essentially be the cost, the total cost of this negative externality if we stopped at the efficient quantity for society. But I won't ask you questions on that, or it doesn't really have a lot of use. Here? 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 Yeah. So what does this represent? Yeah. What is this the difference between? Marginal social cost and marginal social benefits. So if I stopped at the efficient point for the society, what would this actually be? Society's total economic surplus. Right? So this actually represents, if I'm at that socially efficient quantity, this is the total surplus for society, or where total surplus for society is maximized. Yep. All right. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. So we've taken a little bit more time on some of this. So I'll go through this quickly. I then kind of want to touch on something and we'll kind of come back. So this is, I think, the area you were just asking me about. But what does this black area represent? If I was at the efficient point for society, or that efficient point, a quantity for society, the total surplus to society would simply be the difference between my marginal social costs and my marginal social benefits, right? So if I'm at that allocated efficient point for society, here's total surplus. If I allow the market to choose, what's the problem? They're going to overproduce, right? So when I'm at this quantity in the market, here's my what? Consumer producer surplus. Area below demand. Demand is consumers, right? The area on top is consumer surplus. Area below demand but above supply will be my producer surplus. So if I get out to that efficient point for the market, we said, well, what exists for every unit that's sold? There's this additional cost to society, right? That parallelogram. So this producer and consumer surplus that exists in the market is kind of canceled out by this additional cost to society. So if we just want to know about society's total surplus, it would be producer surplus plus consumer surplus minus this total cost to society. So notice we have, this is all cancels out. So total surplus would be whatever it was before, but plus this additional amount. However, this additional amount, when we add it, that economic surplus, if it's representing the cost, the total value of the external cost, that would actually be a negative value. So our total surplus would go from what this black area is, if we were at the efficient point for society, to if we allow the market to make the decision, all we've done is add negative surplus into society's total surplus or created deadweight loss. Okay. So I kind of already drew this out for us, but you kind of have in the slides if you want to kind of use that as an additional resource, just a different way of looking at it, right? And then I kind of drew it out separately to say, like, we don't have to calculate these areas every single time. I really can just focus on calculating the area of that triangle. Yep. Yep. Yeah. So when I'm calculating producer and consumer surplus, I'm just thinking about the consumers and producers in that market. Yep. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. So I've got a quiz that I want to look at. So we got 25 minutes. I think this is good. All right. So let's say I'm going to jump the gun a little bit, but kind of save us some time next week. Okay. So if I've got my market, and here's kind of that market equilibrium price and the market equilibrium quantity. If I have this negative externality, right, I know my marginal social cost will be whatever the marginal cost was plus the value of that external cost or the value of the negative externality. We said there's no positive externalities here, so marginal social benefit is the same as my private marginal benefits. Okay. So society, where does society's marginal cost equal their social benefits? We said that was going to be at a quantity that was lower than what the market chooses. So what's one thing I could do to get this supply curve to match up perfectly with my marginal social cost curve? What's one way we talked about last week I could shift the supply curve? Imposing a tax, right? What would the optimal value of the tax be? How can I get my supply curve to be equal to that marginal social cost curve? Well, what's the difference between those two? The external cost. So I could use a tax that was equal to what? Whatever that value of the external cost is. Right? We said that supply curve on, if I tax a producer, that supply curve decreases or would shift to the left. And if I impose a tax that's exactly equal to the value of the negative externality, now the market supply curve will match up with society supply curve, or their costs will exactly mirror each other. So if I use a tax, right, I can force the market back down to this socially efficient quantity. What's another way I can lower the quantity in the market? What's a real easy one? I usually use international markets. I could just say, guess what? I'm going to impose a quota in this market. Okay. So why might I want to do this, right? If I think that international markets, right, are causing negative externalities on domestic markets, well, I've painted last week as though like all these things the government uses are like bad, evil tools, like they create deadweight loss. But if we have multiple markets we're looking at, potentially that international market could have deadweight loss associated with it because it's hurting my domestic markets. So if I impose a quota, or I impose a tax or tariff on that market, if I decrease the quantity in the international market, I've eliminated that deadweight loss, and that would make sense if the gain to domestic markets was larger than that, right? So even though we're creating deadweight loss in the market by using quotas and taxes, if the loss in the market is less than the deadweight loss I've eliminated, well, then my society would be better off, right? It just gets kind of hard to think about because we usually have to look at like multiple markets sometimes, right? But that's why it's not necessarily that these price controls from the government are a bad thing, right? Because they can help eliminate that deadweight loss by pushing us to the efficient point for society. Right? So what are some other things we said we could use that limit quantity? What if I impose a price what? So if I want to limit quantity, this would be an effective, it doesn't allow the price to go any higher. So this would be a price ceiling. Nobody past this point will be willing to supply this anymore. I can push the quantity to that socially efficient point. I could also use a price floor. Now, if I don't allow the price to go any lower, no consumer is going to want to buy it past this point. So when we think about the tools that we have to kind of solve the negative externality problem, well, it really was that we were seeing the market overproduce. So we want to use the tools that limit quantity. The four tools we had were tax the good, and here the optimal tax would be setting it equal to whatever that external cost was, or the value of the negative externality. We would kind of impose a quota where that quota is equal to whatever that efficient point for society is. And then 3 and 4 here, we had what? Price floors and price ceilings. Gets a little bit trickier to figure out exactly what those prices would be to get us to that socially efficient quantity. but they still could help us limit that quantity, get back down closer to that socially efficient point. Okay? So these are all the tools that we had to solve our negative externality problem. Okay? Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay? Yeah. I mean, there will definitely, with all these, be deadweight loss in the market, right? But creating deadweight loss in the market, kind of the question earlier, just because we eliminate deadweight loss in the market, if that loss of surplus in the market is less than the loss that we've eliminated to society, society would actually be better off. So we're talking about all these are tools to help us decrease deadweight loss to society. All of them will create deadweight loss in the market. They're just tools that help us eliminate deadweight loss to society. Excuse me. Okay. Any other questions here? Okay. So, got what, 20 minutes. I've got something I want to go through afterwards. Hopefully you'll kind of pay attention, but let's go through this relatively quickly. So here we've got what, 12:25. So I want 12:05. So let's do 15. Nope. 15. There we go. So this should show up on the main homepage. Should also be under the quizzes tab. In-class quiz 7.2. Okay? Or 7.1, sorry. 7.1. So today's is going to look a little bit different. When you go to access this quiz, right? So get it pulled up now so you can get it submitted in time. We shouldn't have any Wi-Fi issues based off of the last section. But are you able to get into the quiz? Yeah, right. So I've noticed there's enough people who I think are answering this quiz who aren't showing up in class, which is not the goal of them. So I'm going to have to make things harder, right? So now, if you want to cheat in things, sometimes there's repercussions to that, right? So now to kind of access these quiz, I will give you a number in class. Today's number is 13.13, 13.13. This will allow you to now access the quiz, right? So if you're sitting in your dorm room trying to access these and not come to class, I mean, I guess unless you have microphones set up and can hear me say this in class, you're not going to be able to get into it, okay? So we've now got this quiz access. That's working for everybody, right? That number, 13.13. Not working? 13.13 is not letting you into the quiz? Or is your Wi-Fi not working? Okay, so we'll kind of go through these. Hopefully the Wi-Fi will catch up. It did for the previous section. Is the number I gave you working? That's the only question I want you to answer. Yes, okay, right? So we'll start working through these questions. Hopefully the Wi-Fi in the back starts loading up. We've got a couple minutes to go through these. So this should be a relatively easy one. If I give you a question like this, I've got my marginal social cost, I've got my private marginal cost. What's the difference between those two things? My social costs are simply the cost to my producers, or the private marginal cost, plus what? The value of the external cost. Now here, I asked you what's the value of the externality. You could actually tell me another question. I could say, what type of externality is it? Negative or positive? If the costs are higher, to society, I have a negative externality. The difference is simply at any quantity, I can look at where am I at in society's marginal cost curve, so 55, relative to the private marginal cost, or the supply curve. So 40 minus 55 is 15. Or I could choose this other quantity, right? At any quantity, hopefully I find the same value. I'm only giving you examples where we have a constant external cost. In the real world, does this always happen? Not necessarily. It would just make our math more complicated. I won't do that for you, right? So if I look down here at this lower quantity, what is the marginal social cost? 50. What is my private marginal cost? 35. The difference is still 15. That's as easy as it is as identifying what that external cost is. So if I were to then ask you a follow-up, what would the optimal value of the tax be here? $15, the exact value of our external cost, okay? If instead I say, okay, we have this negative externality of $15, what is my deadweight loss? So I said you could go through this, and I don't think we'll have time today. If we do, I'll get to the end at the end of class. If not, I might start with this just to kind of show you a different depiction. You could find, right, the market is going to choose what quantity here? Wherever supply is equal to demand. Hasn't changed. The market's going to choose a quantity of 60. I could calculate consumer and producer surplus, but then if I want to find out total surplus to society, I would actually have to add in the total value of that external cost, which we said was that like parallelogram. That's probably more complicated than what you need to do. I said probably an easier way to think about this, there's a triangle that represents that deadweight loss, which is going to be what was the loss of surplus to society from the what? Overproduction of the good, right? So we said if I'm thinking about where was the market going to choose a quantity of 60, where would society's marginal benefits be equal to society's marginal cost? A quantity of 50, right? So the overproduction of those 10 units, what is total surplus to society? The difference between society's marginal benefits and marginal costs. So for every one of these 10 units, what's the difference between society's marginal costs and society's marginal benefits? For every unit there, that value would be negative, representing deadweight loss. So we're just looking for the area of this triangle here. We said the height is always going to be what? The height of that triangle is always the difference between marginal social cost and the private marginal cost. So that height should always just be our external cost or negative externality. The base will always be what? The difference between the quantity the market chooses and the efficient point for society, or our overproduction. So here we have what? 10 times 15, triangle, linear demand supply curve, so times 0.5. 10 times 15 times 0.5 should be 75, right? So that will be the value of our deadweight loss. And then I wasn't sure if this unlock thing was going to work, so I had a fail-safe built into this quiz, which I won't in future, which is today's magic number is 13.13 or 13.13. Okay? So you still need to enter it in for this quiz to kind of give you the base points. I won't do that moving forward because now I know that this works with a new quiz system on Canvas. I just always want to have a fail-safe there. Okay? Any questions on either of those before we kind of finish out here today with one more topic? Okay? So you've got 2 minutes still. Everyone, Wi-Fi in the back working? All right. So get those submitted, and we will then look at one more thing today, which is positive externalities. Okay? So positive externalities are going to kind of work the exact opposite of what we were looking at with negative externalities. So all a positive externality is that there's an additional not cost to a market existing, but there's an additional benefit to each unit, or an external benefit now, okay? So if I'm thinking about if I have additional benefits that the market is not taking into consideration, am I going to get too little or too much of something in the market? They're not factoring in additional benefits, so they're going to choose a number that is too low, or they're going to underproduce, okay? So when I'm drawing this out, right, if I think about what this looks like, I've got my private marginal costs, I've got my private marginal benefits, and I have that quantity that the market would choose, right? We'll ignore the price for a second, okay? If I want to model in additional benefits, what curve represents benefits? So I said I'm only going to show you one way to model it to try to simplify it for you. You can technically model it through the supply or demand curve, but if I have additional benefits, it probably makes more sense to model it through the demand curve. If there's an additional benefit at every unit, at every single unit, what would my marginal social benefit be? The marginal social benefit will be, well, what was the marginal benefit to consumers plus the value of that positive externality, or whatever the external benefit per unit was. So at every quantity, society's marginal benefit will be the marginal benefit to the consumer plus some additional amount. Or if there's additional benefits, it looks like a what change to demand? Shift to the right would be increase. Now, demand isn't actually changing. We said society's marginal benefits. Another way we could think about this is it's kind of like society's demand curve, right? The actual market demand curve hasn't changed at all, okay? But society's demand curve or society's marginal benefits are now going to be higher because we factor in that value of the external benefit or the benefit that exists to people outside of the market, okay? So with no negative externalities, our supply curve, our marginal costs are simply going to be society's marginal costs because we don't have any negative externalities now. So where would society's optimal quantity be? Where the marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost, right? This is how we find optimal or allocated efficient points. So society actually wants a quantity that is greater than what the market chooses to get to. So if I think about where my deadweight loss is coming from here, right? I'll show you the simplified way of looking at it, and then I think we'll look at the more complicated way next class, okay? So is the market under or overproducing here? It's at a quantity that is too low, so the market is going to be underproducing. So unlike negative externalities, my deadweight loss came from the overproduction of a good, right? And the fact that the market was producing units that actually had negative surplus. When the market underproduces, what that means is for every unit from where the market stops to where society would want it to be, well, what would be the total surplus to society if we did produce those units? The difference between the marginal social benefit and marginal social costs. So for every unit here, what's the difference between the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost curve? So here's my marginal social benefits. Here's my marginal social costs. Every unit that the market doesn't produce or underproduces by, if we did produce those units, what would exist to society? Well, if the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal cost of society, every one of those units would have what type of economic surplus? Benefits are greater than the cost, so we would have positive economic surplus, but the market stops right here. So now all these units that we're no longer seeing the market produce, that's kind of like surplus we were leaving out on the table, right? Surplus that we're no longer going to see realized because the market won't get up to that socially efficient quantity. So now our deadweight loss triangle, not as technical, but it's not pointing to the left, it's now pointing to the right, just like it did with taxes, okay? So I kind of mentioned this connection earlier, right? But the visual depictions start to look a little bit more similar to taxes with positive externalities, which counterintuitive, and then subsidies kind of start, the depiction looks a little bit more like negative externality. Now, they're depicting different things, right? But hopefully we can kind of start to see some of these connections, okay? So without going through the more complicated way of thinking about deadweight loss, I also want to jump to something that might touch on it again next class, but we can kind of get some of these things out of the way. If I want to get the market to this socially efficient quantity, what's the only tool we talked about that we can use as the government to increase quantity? Started out today with it, subsidies. So how could I get the demand curve to perfectly match up with society's marginal benefit? Well, what's the difference between the demand curve, the private marginal benefits, and society's marginal? That difference is, so I would set my subsidy equal to what? A subsidy would increase that demand curve. So I would set a subsidy exactly equal to whatever the value of that positive externality was, or whatever that per unit external benefit was. So just like we could use taxes to solve the overproduction or the negative externality problem, here to solve the underproduction problem, if we want more of something, we can give out subsidies, okay? Any questions on this idea? Okay. We got 5 minutes here. Well, I'll hold off on, I'll hold off on this. So when I talked earlier about finding deadweight loss for negative externalities and thinking about you could find producer surplus, consumer surplus, find the total cost to society. I'll work through a model where I show you how to do it that way. You won't ever have to do it that way on like an exam or a quiz or anything. You can always just find the area of that triangle. But I do think it's worthwhile working through an example where you see those numbers, okay? So I'll probably start off revisiting negative externalities on Thursday's class. We'll then kind of look at positive externalities. We'll talk about some additional things, the Coase theorem, public goods, things like that. But before I let you get out of here, do you guys think I'm going to be nicer when you just kind of start to take off on me when I'm kind of closing class off, or more? Not that I'm like it's going to influence me, but like I've probably given this speech to you guys before. You all want to get into Kelly. I'm very aware of it. You've all made me pretty aware, right, that it's important to you. Part of being in business is going to be like, down the road, what do you think I have students reach out to me for? Letters of recommendation, right? Or when you're in an environment, a setting where there's this person that you don't know when you're going to interact with them again, right? And you might need something of them in the future. Do you think if you do something that's somewhat disrespectful, you're more or less likely for them to kind of give you a handout down the road, right? You want to make good impressions. And right, I know there's a lot of you, so like if you take off a little early, I'm probably not going to be able to put a name to your face, things like that. But, you know, I also think it's my job, and there's value in me mentioning to you some of these things that, like, I get this as a classroom environment, right? But like, you need to start to build these skills. Like learning economics is great. Like it's a very good skill. That's what we're here for. But you're also here trying to get a business degree, and building some of these skills are like really important. And like, I've done things before in a meeting where I caused a slight to someone by something I didn't even know was disrespectful because of maybe a cultural difference or something like that. If I'm doing something that I obviously know is disrespectful, like that's probably going to cost you down the road, right? So, you know, I don't take it. I don't really actually care. Like if you want to take off them, you can. But I also know that you guys want to be really successful here, and doing little things like that, like I would still, you know, write you, any of you, letter of recommendation if you got a, you know, good enough grade in the class, things like that. But I also know a lot of the other professors here around campus. And I can tell you, a lot of them get a lot more pissed off about stuff like that than I ever even care to put enough energy to get that mad about something for, right? So you can do it to me and it won't be a huge cost. But if you start doing this in other classrooms, I'm just giving you a word of advice. It might start to burn you down the road, okay? Anyways, that's a bit of an aside. And on a more positive note, right? We've got positive externalities, hopefully kind of learning some of this stuff today. You're not in the market necessarily for children, but I am, right? I was a consumer of a kid. So here's a positive externality, cute kid for you guys on the way out, okay? So try to stay dry today, and I will see you on Thursday. Yep, have a good one.